Hi, I'm your State Treasurer, Colleen Davis, and I just want to thank you for joining me again today for another Treasury Talks. This is where we explore some of what's going on in our economy today. And joining me today is Dr. James Butkiewicz of University of Delaware. Dr. Butkiewicz, you are a professor in economics, and I'm just curious if you can kind of start us off by telling us a little bit about what you do at University of Delaware, maybe a little bit of your experience as a radio personality and kinds of things.
Sure, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a professor of economics. I teach macroeconomics and money and banking, which basically deal with whole economies. I've also done some work in regional economics, and over my many years at the University of Delaware, I've done a few radio and television interviews, and long ago I did a weekly radio show on WILM with a stockbroker.
You are sort of one of those go-to individuals just because of your background and all of your knowledge. So I really appreciate you being with us today. You know, one of the things that has been going on now is a lot of us in the financial world, we've been really monitoring closely what's going on in our economy and, you know, some of the effects of the current economic downturn related to the pandemic. Could you discuss some of the cyclical nature of the economic downturns that maybe that we've seen in the past and how it translates to today and how we might navigate the current climate?
Sure. Well, this downturn is actually unique in economic history because of the cause of the downturn. Often downturns are due to economic shocks. In the Great Depression, we had banking crises. In the Great Recession, we had another financial crisis. Some of our recessions in the post-war period were due to increased inflation, and the central bank raised interest rates to try and reduce inflation. But this is really a health crisis, and the health crisis has forced shutdown of some parts of the economy, and that's had a major impact. Certainly, we've seen double-digit unemployment rates, which are very rare. Only in the worst recessions do we see that. Although it's come down, in the latest report was under 10% for the nation. The Delaware rate hasn't come out yet for last month. But it's sort of unique in the nature of the cause, and fighting it with the usual tools is not the only solution, because we really need a solution to the health problem. Low interest rates, more fiscal spending help, but they're not going to end the crisis until we find a way to deal with the flu effectively.
One of the other things I wonder about, just as far as Delaware, do you think that we're in a position to recover in a similar way as the rest of the nation? Are we going to mirror the way that the nation has been recovering? And do you think we'll fare better or worse based on our size and economic positioning?
Well, so far, if you look at a measure like the unemployment rate, our unemployment rate in Delaware has pretty much followed the same path as the national rate. And I think a lot of what's going to happen in the recovery now, and we've had sort of a situation that I don't find surprising. In fact, I expected that we'd have a sharp downturn and then a partially sharp recovery. And I think the last part could be pretty gradual and painful. And the problem is, until people, large numbers of people are really confident in resuming their lives as they were before the pandemic, it's going to be difficult. I mean, I see in the news journal just about every day stories of another business, a restaurant, a small business that's closing, that's going out of business. People just aren't behaving in the same way. Restaurants are operating at very reduced capacity. That's really not what they're geared for. Entertainment venues are just starting to reopen. And again, they're not geared for small audiences. They want a large audience. And until a lot of people really feel comfortable gathering together. Now, there have been reports of groups, large numbers of people gathered together, and people are very upset about this, but still many, many people are still very reluctant to, say, go to a restaurant, go to a show, go to a theater, travel to places where there'd be crowds. And that's going to really affect the pace of the recovery. And that's going to affect a lot of our small businesses in Delaware, which really, I think, have borne a lot of the burden of this. Not that other businesses haven't been affected, but we've seen, there are businesses that have done really well during this because the nature of the pandemic, a company like Amazon, which just keeps adding business sites and employees because more and more people have shopped online. The other side of that is that business came from some other business. The people who buying at Amazon now were purchasing things somewhere else, and that's hurt those businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point. There's a local business in Dover called Actors Attic, and they've been around for a long time. This is sort of more of a personal story, but my mother's a photographer, a professional photographer, and she used to go to Actors Attic a lot and get lots of different costumes and things like that for different events and photo shoots and things like that. I stopped in there because they're going out of business. And I spoke with the owner and I just said, I'm one of 8 children, and my mother's business fed us. And I said, and by way of your business, you contributed to that. And I think those are the types of things that it's that ripple effect that I think we'll see. You're talking about small businesses, and we are a community of small and large businesses, and there is potentially going to be a domino effect, I think, on the smaller businesses and the business community. I think you bring up a really important point.
Yes, it's a similar situation. My wife, who's retired, is a volunteer at the Grand Opera House, and she would be at the Opera House 2 and 3 nights a week. And I know we had tickets for 5 performances from March through, I guess, May, and we didn't go to the Opera House. Those were all postponed or canceled, and we didn't go up to Wilmington to have dinner somewhere before the show. And so all that activity, and we're just one of the hundreds and sometimes thousands of people going to those performances. So all those businesses along Market Street, just as Actors Attic, they're all affected by the Opera House and the Playhouse not having performances right now. It's got to be devastating to so many of these businesses.
Do you think that there are certain businesses that, you mentioned Amazon, do you think, I've sort of seen some of these businesses bob and weave a little bit. Do you think we'll start to see some sort of starting to rise to the top and really survive this?
Oh, sure. There are businesses that were well suited to deal with this. Just for example, in the restaurant business, pizza parlors, takeout restaurants like Chinese restaurants, they should be doing fine and perhaps even better because people are doing more of that. But the really nice sit-down places, I think a lot of people are reluctant to just rejoin. So there are businesses that are well suited to online, to delivery, and there are those that really need walk-in business. And the places that need walk-in business, I think, are the ones that are hurt the most.
Mm-hmm. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the ways that the federal government has attempted to invigorate the economy has been through stimulus payments. Directly to citizens and to government programs and grants for small businesses. Do you believe that these actually work? What's your perspective there?
Well, I think that they were necessary. A lot of people lost their jobs. It was really devastating. And the saddest part about all this is right before this began, our labor market was probably as healthy as it's been in the post-war period. Unemployment was very low. We were seeing even wages at the lowest level starting to show good increases, which has been a problem for a long time. People at the low end of the wage scale just weren't seeing their wages increase. And we're starting to see signs of a really robust labor market, and now that's all been set back. And people lost their jobs and through no fault of their own because things were shut down. And so the government aid has certainly helped, and it certainly hasn't covered everyone, but of those it's gotten money to, it certainly helped them continue to operate, continue to have some income, although the extra unemployment benefits ended at the end of July. That certainly helped those families. There's no question about it. And I know some small business people too that I deal with, and they say, the programs help them get through a rough patch, and then things started to pick up. But for example, the place where I get my car repaired, I know the owner is a good friend, and been friends for a long time. And he said, yeah, the payroll protection plan helped, and then business had really dried up, and then it started to pick up. I think now they're back to doing a normal business. But it certainly did help while it was in place for those businesses that were able to take advantage of it.
And I think one of the things that we may end up seeing, you mentioned your friend who's an auto mechanic. I wonder if, as a result of this, we start to see people buckling down a little bit on their spending, things like that, getting a little bit more protective of their savings, and maybe onto a car for a bit longer, and maybe frequenting that auto mechanic a little bit more. And that may be where we start to see those small businesses.
Well, we've definitely seen in the national data, we've definitely seen signs of increased saving. Households are saving more and spending less. And one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, we can't go out and spend money on things we used to do. So, we had vacations planned and they got canceled. So that money's not being spent. And, subscribing to Netflix is a lot cheaper than taking a long vacation somewhere or going on a cruise or something like that.
I think there's a lot that we're sort of seeing on both ends of the spectrum, but sort of back to the concept of stimulating households. What about that tax withholding concept, the FICA tax withholding concept that there's been a lot of talk about? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it's right now, it's not a tax reduction. It's just a tax postponement. It's sort of like a loan. They're going to not collect the taxes on people below a certain income level, but then that money's due next year. Now, whether that money is actually collected next year or whether it's forgiven makes a big difference. But if I'm a worker and I have a decent income and I'm making ends meet, and I get a little more of my paycheck, but I know I'm going to get less in the January, February, March, April, I may just want to save that money. It's not at all clear when something is so obviously temporary that everybody's going to go out and spend it. I'm sure some people will. Some people who really are struggling to make ends meet will, probably spend some or all of it. But I think a lot of people, particularly as you get towards the higher end of the incomes that are going to be affected, a lot of people are going to say, what's the point of this? Because I'm just going to have less after the first of the year. So maybe I'll just set this aside and spend it later. And we know, again, in economics, that when people view these sorts of things as temporary, it has far less of an impact on their behavior than when it's permanent. So people who can afford to save and take, a temporary tax cut or a temporary tax increase, that affects their consumption as much or more as their savings, if they're in a position that they can afford to do that. Obviously, people with the lowest incomes may not be in that position, but people with higher incomes can really adjust their saving to offset these temporary tax changes.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point in that this could end up becoming very difficult for people if it's not forgiven come January. Coming up with a significant amount of money could be very difficult for people, especially if they've used those funds to help bridge the gap for some of those essential things.
Yeah, definitely. That the people who probably will be most affected are the people with the lowest incomes, because they're the ones most likely to spend, and then they'll be the ones hardest hit if they have to pay it back next year.
So it sounds like we've got to get a little bit more creative about how to support individuals.
The thing about it is the president can temporarily suspend the tax collections, but it takes legislation to actually make it a permanent cut. make, forgive the tax, the reduction in withholding right now. And that requires that Congress do something, and, it's election season, so we know what that means. We're probably not going to see any results until after the new government is sworn in January.
I really appreciate you taking the time today and all of your insight. Dr. Butkiewicz, we've got to make this a regular thing, I think.
Well, I'd be happy if it helps. That's, I'm always willing to help out if you find it productive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's great chatting with you anyway. I think one of the things that's been hardest has just been connecting with people. We've really lost the social aspect of our lives lately, and it's a little scary, to venture out. So
it is, and some firms have talked about moving more to permanent work at home, but I've read articles about other firms that say, there are synergies when everybody comes together, and that those aren't happening nearly as well or as much now because we're not coming together. I know that, you miss going to work, seeing your colleagues and talking over all the things that you would talk over at work. And, that stimulates thinking and so forth. And that can be very productive. That's why you see business organizations clustered together. That's why you see a place like Silicon Valley, because there's so many people there. Here in Delaware, we have a really strong financial services sector, and an awful lot of people work in financial services, and they do feed off one another, and that's really beneficial. In academics, as I'm sure in government, going to work with your colleagues and being able to discuss the issues and your ideas and so forth is very important. And that's lacking right now. I mean, we're trying to do things virtually, but it's still better being there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, because some of these conversations spurn that organic, thought process, ideas, things like that. And so just being able to connect with you today is really wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Dr. Butkiewicz at University of Delaware, our infamous professor of economics, macroeconomics, and a historian. Well, thank you again. Be safe and stay healthy and well.
And you as well.
Thanks so much.